If you ask a casual music fan what they associate with the Beach Boys, chances are they'll tell you about songs with carefree lyrics, about California, chasing girls, and of course, surfing. That's not necessarily inaccurate. The Beach Boys did have lots of songs like that. But perhaps thinking that that's all there was to the Beach Boys misses a lot of the depth of what the band had to offer. In fact, the Beach Boys penned some of the most affecting and heartbreaking songs in the history of popular music. On their 1971 album Surf's Up, however, the band would commit to tape possibly their saddest song, a rumination on the existential question of what one individual's life can mean against the greater picture of the universe. The song offered up a view of a man utterly beside himself, in the midst of complete mental breakdown. Though it doesn't have the fame attached to the group's most well-known singles, it does have a universality of meaning, summing up a feeling we've probably all felt at some point or another in our own lives. This is the story of Till I Die, the Beach Boys' saddest song.
Let's hear it for the Beach Boys!
In the 1960s, the Beach Boys established themselves as one of America's most premier rock bands. From their 1962 debut album onwards, the Beach Boys seemed to almost embody the sound of sunny California. In a decade plagued by the threat of war, racial struggle and uncertainty, the Beach Boys offered distraction, levity and escape. The band's sound was boppy, innocuous and infectious, with lyrics often focusing on the summertime and that season's primary preoccupation, surfing.
In the morning we'll be starting out, some honeys will be coming along. We're loading up the woodies with the boards inside and heading out singing our song. Come on baby, wait and see, yeah, I'm gonna take you surfing.
The band would dig their toes in, clinging to their signature sound on a string of albums released throughout the early and mid-60s. The sheer pace of productivity and demand was taking a toll on the band, however. Brian Wilson, the band's primary songwriter, was especially feeling the pressure. In 1964, Wilson would suffer a full-blown mental breakdown, exacerbated by the band's constant circus of touring, recording and writing. He recalled, "We were going to Houston to kick off a 2-week tour. The plane had been in the air only 5 minutes when I told Al Jardine I was going to crack up any minute. He told me to cool it. Then I started crying. I put a pillow over my face and began screaming and yelling. Then I started telling people I'm not getting off the plane. I was getting far out, coming undone, having a breakdown, and I just let myself go completely. The rubber band had stretched as far as it would go." That unease and dislocation would increasingly creep its way into the band's sound. On Pet Sounds, the band's 1966 masterpiece, against the group's trademark mellifluous layered vocal harmonies, it was easy to discern a more vulnerable, introspective young man at the core of the record.
They say I got brains, but they ain't doing me no good. I wish they
Indeed, a closer listen to many of the records made during this time show a clear, ineffable melancholy just beneath the surface. You just had to ignore the smooth sounds of the band's honeyed vocals and actually listen closely to the lyrics. Variously, Wilson would lament about feeling a lack of confidence or feeling out of tune with the world entirely.
And please forgive my shaking. Can't you tell my heart is breaking? Can't make myself say what I plan to say.
To cope, Wilson would experiment with LSD, a drug that he said supercharged his creativity, but also muddied his thoughts. In an interview looking back on his career, Wilson would say of his experimentation with the drug, "At first my creativity increased more than I could believe. On the downside, it fucked my brain." With Wilson's mental health in freefall, and the band increasingly finding themselves used and manipulated by figures in the band's entourage, a greater despondency set in. By 1970, it meant that the Beach Boys were lacking a clear sense of direction and purpose, and their album sales were waning. It seemed the band were off course, as if they were trapped in the rip current, taking them dangerously away from safe harbour. On the band's 1971 album Surf's Up, it was immediately clear from the artwork that this was a group very different to the proposition they were 10 years ago. In muted greens and scuzzy blacks, the record's cover depicts a solitary man on a horse, both rider and steed's heads bowed, as if in defeat or capitulation. It's a depressing image, one which stands in stark contrast to the bright hues and primary colours of the band's earlier sunlit album covers. Even the album title itself, Surf's Up, was a riposte, a knowing mocking of the gulf of what audience expected of the band's sound, and where their creative intentions lay now. In the album's subject matter, the band would show how much they'd developed, taking on the subject of environmental crisis on the album opener Don't Go Near the Water.
Oceans, rivers, lakes and streams have all been touched by man. Poison floating out to sea now threatens life on land.
However, it was toward the end of the record where Wilson's depression would rear its head again. Mixing his sadness with arboreal imagery, on a day in the life of a tree, Wilson sounds utterly disconsolate. But it's on Till I Die where Wilson would most directly and tenderly communicate the depths of his heart's sadness. The song was reportedly written when Wilson was alone at night, pondering his place in the world and looking out onto the deep blue of the sea, wrestling with his isolation, an increasing sense of marginalisation within his band. Wilson once again lays bare the desperate sadness within himself. In the song, he likens himself to a measly cork, adrift on the great expanse of the ocean's waves, to be swept into oblivion forever.
I'm a cork on the ocean, floating over the raging sea. How deep is the ocean?
For the song's chords, it's reported that Wilson would sit at his piano and that he would change the voicing of the chords subtly, moving up and down the piano keys, adjusting his fingers ever so slightly to evoke new sounds by adjusting one or two notes. This resulted in a range of chords being used that seemed to have a slight dissonance to them. At the same time, they work together, even if some of the shifts the chords take do require some adjustment on the part of the listener. The melody of the chords suggests the undulations of the ocean's movements, the crest and fall of every wave that Wilson sings about in the song. It also possibly suggests the erratic shifts that were occurring in Wilson's mind, oscillations that would change his brain chemistry, leaving him high and low at will. Against the push and sway of these fluctuations, Wilson tells us that he's like a cork on the ocean, a rock in a landslide, and a leaf on a windy day, all insignificant, transient things at the beck and call of a wider force. They paint a vivid picture of a weakened man, confused and lost in a world that he doesn't quite seem to understand. In the coda of the song, however, the tune seems to signal a shift from misunderstanding to acceptance, as Wilson sings repeatedly that he knows that he will be like this until his final breath. perpetually meaningless and subject to the greater whims of the universe. It feels almost like an incantation, as if Wilson is reassuring himself that he, like all of us, is just a grain of sand in the microcosm.
These things are me until I die. These things are me until I die. These things are me until I die. These things are...
In its own way, the lyrics suggest, there is a liberation in our insignificance, an understanding that one doesn't need to carry that realization alone if we're all subject to the same feeling. In our insignificance, the song says, we're alone, together. When the album was released, many people didn't quite know what to make of the song. Bruce Johnston, one of the Beach Boys, called Till I Die one of Wilson's heaviest songs, and the song marks itself out in the band's back catalogue as being both uniquely metaphorical and yet visceral about how it communicated Wilson's despair. After this album's release, the band were a long way from their earlier jangly, benign sound, but on Till I Die, Brian Wilson penned a song for the ages, in which he laid bare his questioning of the universe's ways in all of its confounding nature. In the song's final moments, he seems to signal his own acceptance too. It's an affirmation that life may submerge us sometimes, but that one must soldier on, even if we don't know what awaits us after the ripples settle. One has to be like the surfer, who doesn't know that morning if he'll be riding the crest of a great wave or whether he'll crash out. You just have to go with it. If you dug this video, let me know what you think of the song in the comment section, and remember to hit like and subscribe to get more videos like this in the future. Thanks for watching, and catch you in the next one.